Deep doctrine is complex. It has elements to it that are hard to think through. The doctrine of election and the responsibility of the human will is not an easy doctrine to comprehend in the human mind. And therefore, I think folk culture is unsuited to preserve it from generation to generation. Therefore, I believe in higher education, because somebody has to do some serious thinking and writing to preserve from generation to generation the great, complex vision of God that is there in the Bible in pieces.
I think many of us want our worship songs to feel warm and familiar, but that doesn't always help us hold on to the doctrines that are hard to think through. I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper challenges us to consider what kind of worship songs can carry the weight of deep biblical truth from one generation to the next. The seminar was originally delivered on Wednesday evening, September 26, 1990.
Thoughts on worship and culture. This is kind of a theoretical foundation for the discussion of the practicalities of how we do it at Bethlehem, how we worship. What should Sunday morning worship look like in terms of hymns, contemporary music, liturgies, instrumentation, sermon forms and length and timing, language that we use. We need to begin to reflect at a fairly fundamental level, I think, on these things, rather than jumping to the front of the discussion and saying, should we sing that song or that song? Should we use guitars or only organ? Should we have brass or should we have string? That's a premature question until we've thought about some pretty basic things. Now, this may sound a little bit theoretical to some of you, but it's exciting to me, so I'm going to talk about it. These are sort of meditations and ruminations on worship and culture. Point number one, there is very little in the New Testament about the forms and style and content of corporate worship. Following Old Testament forms, which are really quite many in the New Testament, in the Bible, following them too closely contradicts, I believe, the obsolescence of the wineskins. You know what I'm referring to there? Jesus, they came to him and said, why do John's disciples fast and you don't fast? You and your disciples aren't fasting. And one of the things he said in response was, because new wine needs new wineskins, and you'll break the old wineskins if you put new wine into old wineskins. I think he's talking about Old Testament forms there that are going to be exploded. The sacrificial system is going to be changed and numerous things. And so if we try to take over Old Testament religious practices, we'll be guilty, I think, of violating the obsolescence of the wineskins. God must mean, therefore, to leave the matter of form and style and content to the judgment of our spiritual wisdom. This is just my inference from the absence of information in the Bible about New Testament worship. Not, I say, to our whim or our tradition, when I say judgment and spiritual wisdom, but to prayerful, thoughtful, culturally alert, self-critical, Bible-saturated, God-centered, Christ-exalting reflection. That's what I mean by spiritual wisdom here. Driven by a passion to be filled with all the fullness of God. I'm really not interested in discussing worship with people who don't have that passion. You know, sort of liturgical specialists or something like that, who just have an artsy interest in spirituality. I'm interested in talking form with people who pray, fill me with all the fullness of God. Give expression to all the fullness of God in this service. With that person, I can go a long way, no matter how different we are in terms of our convictions about form. I assume this will be an ongoing process at Bethlehem, not a one-time effort. In other words, the reflection that we're doing in this class on worship is going to have to go on forever till Jesus comes back. Because if we all at this moment said, we know exactly what we want to do next Sunday, we all agree on it, well, that would be the end of it for a few weeks, months, a year, two, but then we'd be different. The atmosphere would be different. The culture would be different. New music would be on the scene. New people would be on the scene. Everything is in flux. And in our day, it's in faster flux probably than it's ever been. So I'm talking process here, not finished product on this matter of worship form. Number two, one way to describe the differences in how people approach worship is to speak in terms of fine culture and folk culture. Now, I'm creating these terms, and I'm going to define them the way I want to define them. So don't bring your own definitions here. You listen to mine. And we're going to use these Piper terms. And everything I have to say the rest of the time is to talk about fine culture and folk culture. By culture, I mean a pattern of life including thought, and emotion, and speech, and activities. It's a big overarching term for sort of what you're like, or what your church is like, or what your family is like. Or by fine culture, I have in mind the pattern of life that puts a high priority on intellectual and artistic expressions that require extraordinary ability to produce and often demand disciplined efforts to understand and appreciate. It's fine culture, have in mind pattern of life that puts a high priority on intellectual and artistic expressions that require extraordinary ability to produce. So it's a genius that comes along generally that can produce something of that kind, and therefore demand disciplined efforts to understand and appreciate. I'll give examples in a minute. By folk culture, I have in mind the pattern of life that puts a high priority on expressions of heart and mind that please and help average people without demanding unusual effort. So those are my general definitions of fine culture and folk culture. And please, I have no value judgments to pass at this time. In fact, I'm not going to pass any. Here's some examples. For example, it's the difference between classical music and bluegrass, or easy listening, or rock, or show tunes, or oldies, or country western, all of which are the music of the people, though I realize there is a continuum rather than a neat box for all kinds and qualities of music. I'm just giving illustrative pointers towards what I mean here. Another example would be the contrast between Shakespearean drama, the most demanding of all drama. You can't ever understand what they're saying unless you've read the play, at the Guthrie, and The Empire Strikes Back at the theater, or Return of the Jedi, or whatever. In other words, this is folk culture, and that's fine culture. The demand put on the watcher is radically different in both cases. And then another example. One might think of the difference between reading Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, The Window Over to Christ Our Lord. This just sticks out in my memory like crazy because when I was a lit major back in college, I read this poem 100 times and never could understand it. It goes like this. It begins starting like this. This is a classic. This is read by all modern American lit majors. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn-drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a whipple wing. What in the world? And we spent days on this poem. It's about 15 lines long. We spent days struggling with this poem. First of all, figuring out what the words meant, and then what the grammatical construction. You look at it and you say, this is not English. This is just a stringing of words. And it's a very famous poem. So obviously he has convinced a certain level of culture that it's good. It's real. He really means this. And Gerard Manley Hopkins is a great poet. There are others that I understand that he wrote, but I never could get the wind over to Christ our Lord. So that's fine culture. It's demanding. On the other hand, reading homespun poetry like Edgar A. Guest, it takes a heap of living to make a house a home. My dad read Edgar Guest to us when I was growing up. I'm glad he did. He was a great, my dad was in 30 Shakespearean dramas in college. He got an award for being the most dramatic person. And yet he could appreciate Edgar A. Guest. All of you can write poems like Edgar A. Guest wrote poems. Takes a heap of living to make a house a home. I remember Daddy saying that again and again. So you got the flavor of what I mean now by fine culture and folk culture. All right. We should not pass judgment on fine culture or folk culture per se. I do not believe anybody should pass judgment on the differences that I just gave you. And I know gut reactions, all of you are doing that right now. You're either one or the other, or you're a little bit in the middle and cut both ways. And you can't understand anybody who listens to public radio instead of WDGY or whatever. And then the other way around. There are caricatures of the excesses in both that are easy to condemn. That's not our purpose here. It is more profitable to consider the strengths and weaknesses built into both of them so as to avoid the weaknesses and affirm the strengths in both. Fine culture and folk culture have intrinsic vulnerabilities to sin and unique potentialities for God-glorifying goodness. They are redeemable. Both of them are useful and redeemable. Now let's go at that a little bit. What are some of the vulnerabilities and what are some of the potentials? First, let's talk about vulnerabilities of high culture or fine culture and vulnerabilities of folk culture. First, intrinsic vulnerabilities of high culture include elitism and snobbishness. In demanding high levels of intellect and skill, it easily inflates the ego of those who succeed in it and tempts them to look with contempt on folk culture. I think that's probably the most significant vulnerability of fine culture. They tend, it need not be, but the tendency is there by human nature to look down their nose at people who do not appreciate symphonies or orchestra or the Walker Art Museum or fine dining or whatever. The intrinsic tendency is towards snobbishness and elitism and looking down at the simpler achievements of folk culture. It easily isolates technical expertise from the larger issues of life and attempts to give it intrinsic value, this technical expertise. It attempts to give that technical expertise intrinsic value instead of defining its value in relation to other more important spiritual and personal realities. It is inevitably less accessible to average people and therefore tends toward performance rather than participation. If you produce something that's so good only you can perform it, or only your choir can perform it, or only this organist can perform it, or only that brass can perform it, then all the other people can do is watch and enjoy. But they don't play along like they would maybe in folk culture. And this performance orientation carries again the tendency toward an atmosphere of aloofness and distance. So those are some of the vulnerabilities. Now you want to respond to that or add to it or question any of my sense of what the vulnerabilities. I'm not saying this has to happen in any high, fine culture, but I think it's a built-in tendency and danger. By this one, that was a complicated sentence when I said take technical expertise. I think there are people who become so fascinated with their pursuit of technical expertise, they begin to abstract it from who takes the garbage out. Or that is, they abstract it from life. And they start to feel like they have significance in the world because they can hit a certain note or play a certain piece flawlessly, whether it does anything for anybody. It just begins to abstract. So when you pose that question, what instrumentation is right and good for this congregation at this era in this culture to do the kind of worship that we believe God's calling us to do? Is it this organ or that organ? Or can we live with a synthesizer? That could be orchestra and organ, or both. I'm just talking foundational reflection right now. Now, what about the vulnerabilities of folk culture? Intrinsic vulnerabilities of folk culture include laziness. and carelessness. There is an intrinsic drift towards increasing indifference to the simple disciplines that define excellence at the most rudimentary levels. And I want to underline that because I'm not talking about falling short of a certain finery in excellence. I'm talking about becoming increasingly negligent about the most rudimentary expectations of excellence, like using bad grammar in worship songs, like "You reigneth." That's on our overhead. I stumble over it every time. "You reigneth." That's bad grammar. Or having "you" and "thou" in the same line to refer to God. Why mix up the Elizabethan and contemporary English in one line? Can't we get it straight? I mean, it's so simple to say you instead of, or thou. Why? This is not like the word "ain't" in "You ain't nothing but a hound dog," which is perfectly legitimate culture. It's like singing "Thou ain't nothing but a hound dog." That's what I hear. We should get it straight. Folk culture, with its intrinsic anti-intellectualism, tends to short-circuit the mind and move the emotions with shortcuts. Thus, folk culture is not generally a preservative force for great biblical doctrine. Now, I'm going to come to some real strong strengths. So if this sounds, when Dan Lane first heard me read this on Monday, he said, "You sound prejudiced." And I'm sure I am, but I think I'm prejudiced in both directions. And we need to chip at each other's prejudices here. I have some things that I value in both of these spheres very much. And you'll see that as I turn to the positive potentials. So those are the vulnerabilities I see in folk culture. You can all imagine the kinds of things that would represent folk culture in the area of worship. The positive potentials of fine culture include the preservation of what we might call the life of the mind. Now, I'm arguing now for the value of fine culture. One is the preservation of what we might call the life of the mind. Fine culture is more likely than folk culture to inject into the stream of society the commitment to think hard and think clearly. It is more likely than folk culture to keep the intellect from atrophying. That means drying up. It is especially crucial that Christians not surrender the life of the mind to the secular world. First, because it belongs to God and He commanded us to love Him with our minds. And second, because we will lose succeeding generations if we do not have intellectually credible expressions of faith to pass on to them. And it's so short-sighted to notice that a certain folk culture medium moves people more powerfully than a certain fine culture medium and draw the conclusion that in the long run this is better. Which is a very short-sighted, foolish thing to do because there are bigger things at stake, longer things at stake than whether this particular group of people are moved in this particular way at this moment. That's important. I hope I've made it clear. I mean, I just commend to you my observations. You can, of course, say you've seen the world wrong. These are my observations of reality. And therefore, folk culture is intrinsically anti-intellectual. Now, see, I'm not going to say that's all bad. Because if all we had was intellect, we'd be awful people. It is intrinsically anti-intellectual. And therefore, it is intrinsically unsuited to preserve deep doctrine. Because deep doctrine is complex. It has elements to it that are hard to think through. The doctrine of election and the responsibility of the human will is not an easy doctrine to comprehend in the human mind. And therefore, I think folk culture is unsuited to preserve it from generation to generation. Therefore, I believe in higher education. Because somebody has to do some serious thinking and writing to preserve from generation to generation the great, complex vision of God that is there in the Bible in pieces. one of the questions to ask once you've laid all this stuff on the table is the goal to jump from one end of the continuum to the other? You know, go to a symphony on Friday night and go to Grand Ole Opry the next night? Is that the goal? Or is the goal to find kinds of expressions where creative people have brought fine culture and folk culture together? I mean, there are people who have made an extraordinary science out of folk stuff, so that it just kind of tends to move here, and jazz might be the best example of that. Jazz is a kind of music that I never have gotten into at all. I have nothing in me likes jazz. But I've read about it, and I listen to it, and I'm trying to figure out, what is this? What's going on here? And it's clearly folk, and yet it's not just folk, especially in its certain forms. It's complex and thoughtful. We need to be touched and give expression to different parts of our being, some of which is real earthy and folksy, and some of which is awesomely profound and complex. And therefore, it matters what forms are offered to us for our expression. There is absolute truth, I believe. There is absolute beauty, I believe. There is absolute right and wrong, I believe. Folk culture is unsuited for preserving correspondences between art and that, because folk culture does not measure itself by ideals, it measures its success by effectiveness. Can we move the people? Can we sell the books? Can we stir up the emotions? Folk culture is pragmatic to the core. Does it work on the radio? Does it work on the television? Does it sell the books? It does. People don't sit in rooms and say, is it faithful to the ideal of truth, as we sing this song on the radio? That's another level of reflection. And I'm saying simply that fine culture, with its preoccupation with excellence according to an ideal, has the potential in our culture of preserving commitment to absoluteness, commitment to objectivity, anti-relativism. And I think that potential has been prostituted and squandered, so that you find in fine culture today almost the same relativism and so on that you do in folk culture.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Light and Truth, where we are committed to providing God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 9-part series, The Shape of Worship in a Changing World, with a seminar titled, Worship Between Worlds. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.